Hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our audience here in the room and our audience online to the Future of Work Summit, the 2023 edition. I'm Katrona Sari. I'm director of the TASK platform here at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. TASK stands for Thinking Ahead on Societal Change, and we're a platform that is supported by the Swiss government and hosted here at the Graduate Institute with the aim of bringing together the rich community here in multilateral organizations and other stakeholders in Geneva and beyond to convene on topics of large societal transformation, starting with the future of work. We've been hosting this summit for the last 3 years, starting in the pandemic, and it's great to see the engagement building around this topic and also how the topic has evolved. I'm going to speak for just a few minutes before handing over to our directrice, Marie-Laure Salle, the director of the Geneva Graduate Institute, for her keynote welcome to the summit, and then to our opening panel. I'd just like to start with a few words of thanks. First of all, to our supporters in the Swiss government, specifically SECO and the FDFA, represented here by Ambassador Valérie Berset today, who I would like to personally thank, along with Mr. Boris Zirker, who's head of the Labour Affairs Directorate, for their guidance and their engagement in the activities of the TASK platform. Secondly, I'd very much like to thank the ILO, who've been extremely supportive of our activities and of us building on the rich agenda that they are shaping at the International Labour Conference in the Palais des Nations, just across the road as we speak. So our conference this year is shadowing that agenda of the International Labour Conference, where they're discussing current labour policy issues on the topic of social justice, just transitions, apprenticeships, and social protection, labour protection in particular. We're using our summit as a vantage point into the future for that. So we think of a summit both in terms of having eminent speakers and thinkers around the table, but also as a point for a broader, wider outlook on issues. So to step out of the day-to-day nitty-gritty, to think a little bit bigger, to bring in some broader perspectives, and to discuss with people who come with you along that journey before going back into the melee below. So we hope you'll join us over the next 3 days in our future thinking around these hot topics being discussed at the International Labour Conference. In the ILO, I'd like to thank in particular the DG's office, the Office of the Director General, Mr. Gilbert Hombo, who have been extremely supportive in helping us shape our agenda this week, to the experts we'll have around the table, to Mr. Rick Sammons, who's joining us on the panel this afternoon, and his research department, and to Martin Moen and his communications department, who've been really engaged with us through this process. We would finally like to thank our partners over the next 2.5 days. Our agenda will be built around those topics that I mentioned earlier, just transitions, apprenticeships, and social protection. And following each of our panel discussions, we have a series of breakout discussions where we're working with partners like the World Economic Forum, PwC, Geneva Macro Labs, the ILO, and our friends here at the Graduate Institute, Center for Trade and Economic Integration, the Geneva Trade Platform, amongst others. So we really hope that you will stay and dive into some of those workshops, getting into the nitty-gritty of topics and envisaging the future. And I would like to say a huge thanks to those partners for joining us this week. Final thanks goes to our TASK platform team. It's a wonderful team of power women. I was noted today that we're all ladies, apart from our brilliant co-chairs. has been leading our communications and making everything beautiful, and to Myrtle, who has been coordinating our Youth Thinking Ahead team. So throughout the day, you'll be hearing questions and insights from students here at the Graduate Institute who've been helping us frame our thinking on these subjects. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to the director of the Institute, Marie-Laure Salle, for some welcome words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitrona. Very warm welcome to all of you. I'm really delighted to be here and to welcome you at the Geneva Graduate Institute at the Maison de la Paix for this opening plenary of the Future of Work Summit that is organized by the TASK platform. So I was going to say a set of thank yous, but since Kitrona has been saying all of the thank yous, I'll just say that I'm totally behind the thank yous and I'm adding my own thank yous to all institutions and partners mentioned and to all individuals that have been mentioned by Kitrona. I will nevertheless say again a big thank you to this task team, to obviously Cédric and Richard, who are running this task platform for now a number of years, and for the entire team. But I will just, if you allow me, not repeat the same thank yous, because that might be a bit too long and boring, but the heart is there. I promise you that it's there. So the title of this first plenary session is A Fresh Take on the Future, Looking Through the Lens of Social Justice. The International Labour Organization was created the same year and in parallel to the League of Nations, clearly as a testimony to the centrality of work in the self-projection of European and North American continents, who drove, we have to admit, the birth of the first multilateral architecture at the turn of the 20th century. When it is non-alienated, labor is, according to Karl Marx, which should be cited in that context, I think, the essence of humanity and the driving force of self-realization and freedom. In the Bible, if you think about it, on the other hand, work emerges in fact as the result of Adam's fall and curse, a punishment imposed on humanity by an angry God. Paradise, by the way, was free of work. Communism is not free of work, only of alienated and alienating work. So what is today, you know, with those two extremes, what is today the future, or rather, what are the possible futures of work? That question is difficult, I would argue, to separate from the question of the future of our production and consumption system, of our value chains, but also of our financial system. It is also difficult to separate from the question of technology and its contemporary evolution. It is impossible to ask about the futures with an S of work without considering the futures of our planet, of our oikos, our common ecological home, and of some of the non-replenishable resources that are conditions for our collective and individual survival. Last but not least, it is impossible to envision the futures of work without asking ourselves the question of equity and justice, which obviously both the ILO summit and this task platform event are asking and calling to the fore. In other terms, we cannot today think of our futures in a unidimensional manner. We have to approach the question systemically, which naturally makes this quite a complex exercise. The exercise is made even more complex by the radical uncertainty that defines our contemporary predicament. The challenges of our age, whether speaking about war and the return of the nuclear threat, the climate, the destruction of biodiversity and vital resources, extreme inequalities and their profoundly disruptive social and political consequences, future pandemics, maybe, cyber wars and systemic disinformation and their impact on many things, but also on democracies, have a number of commonalities. First, they are truly global and they will impact all of us, even though in different ways. We are all on the same rough seas, but our boats are different depending on where we stand in different parts of the world. Second, they all have potentially an existential impact. By that, I mean that they could question our individual or species survival. And if not, they could profoundly redefine what it means to be human. I don't know if you tried this, but I tried the Office of the Future in the corridor here. And I felt totally dehumanized. But okay, we can have a discussion on that. And this is, one of the things I mean by that. Third, these challenges and the crises they're associated with are not anymore coming one after the other. They overlap, they interact, and they interplay with each other. Each of those challenges is in itself what we call a wicked challenge in our, social science language. Wicked challenge is characterized by social complexity, absence of single or simple solution, no stopping point, and an unexpected chain of consequences. And the reality of our contemporary predicament, in fact, is that we have to face the coexistence and the interplay of many different wicked challenges at the same time. A kind of wicked bundle of wicked challenges that form system and work into each other. Needless to say that this is exactly the source of the age of radical uncertainty that we're living, this age of unknown unknowns. So what will happen to work in that context? There are three ideal typical scenarios that I would like to propose here, which means that obviously hybrids between those scenarios are certainly possible and probably likely. A first path or first scenario is for the alienating nature of work to expand further and broader. The idea here is that human work remains a centrally defining feature of our societies for simple survival or social control reasons, or both actually, but that the economic dynamics that we live in today do not change much, and hence keep encouraging, as they do today, the commodification of everything, and in particular of work. In that scenario, the spaces for the idealized Marxist vision of work that I mentioned before are definitely reduced even further. But humanity is kept at work to prevent too much economic, but also probably too much social and political disruptions, but in forms of work that are, once again, more and more commodified and more alienating. A second path or scenario gives much more space to the current technological storm and its potential to destroy altogether human work. So it's not just that human work remains in this degraded form, but that it gets destroyed further. Whether or not this destruction path will be creative in the end, creative destruction, is an open question. But the social and in all likelihood political violence of this storm is quite clear in the medium term. Should we expect the rapid densification of what Yuval Noah Harari calls a useless class, that is 90% of all of us, that becomes pushed to the margins of the world of work, which in our current society means being pushed to the periphery, in fact, of humanity? And what then? A universal basic income for all of us? And then going back to some of the more poetic pages of Marx, of taking care of our cows and animals in the morning and philosophing in the afternoon with small amounts of money to survive, or the most violent Luddite upheaval that we've ever seen in human history could also be an alternative, obviously, in that context, in the context of a destruction of work by technology. There's a third path or scenario, and even though it may seem at times today to be the least likely, it is in reality the only one we have and the only one we should have. Let us reinvent work and our relationship to work in a way that puts humanity, dignity, and justice at the core. And let us give ourselves as a target to achieve that for all of us. Let us affirm that as a realist utopia and work on it. This is not a Marxian vision of work as an essential tool of self-realization. I'm not fully convinced by this Marxist argument that we can only self-realize through work. I do believe that the two notions really are not systematically correlated. But as long as we have not found a way to live a decent life without work, which is the case today, we haven't found that path yet, maybe we will find it one day, then our target should be to put as much as possible work at the service of humanity and not the other way around, humanity at the service of work and what it produces. We should have as a target to instill more dignity and justice, but also meaning. And that's what the young generations definitely want, meaning also in what we all do for a living. This will call for a number of things. First, it implies that we bring back the current technological transformation under our own political control. This office of the future, we have to do something about it, definitely. making sure that we do not accept the self-fulfilling prophecy of artificial intelligence destroying human intelligence. Second, it also implies that we take the next vigorous step in questioning a model of growth to replace it by a model of social prosperity, which is very different. Third, this in turn implies a deep transformation of our economic system and its driving narrative from the maximization of shareholder value as supposedly driving general welfare, which has turned to be a very dangerous myth, to the preservation and the production of common goods as the only sustainable source of value creation for the individual and the collective. Fourth, we need to transform the relationship that we have with our environment from essentially extractive dynamics to regenerative ones. And finally, we certainly have to change our cultural relationship to consumption, at least in the richest parts of the world, from too much having to maybe a little bit more of being. Well, that's not a small task indeed, what I'm putting on the table, but the question is, do we really have a choice? Is there any alternative? My answer would be no. I've put on the table some thoughts which are here to provoke, definitely, provoke discussion and reactions, and I'm very much looking forward to that in the panel that will follow. Thank you very much to all of you.
Yeah. Thank you, Marie-Laure. And I'm sure we're going to have, reaction to that. I'm trying still to stick to a bit to my script, even though I have to love to actually follow up directly on some of your comments. But I'll first have a round of questions to both Rick Simons from the ILO and Ambassador Berset on the broader, their view on social justice. Because of course, I'm sure if we cross someone in the street, ask his or her definition of the term, there's a lot of variation. So I'll start with you, Rick, and just as Kitrona says, you're head of the research at the ILO, and it's a busy 2 weeks for the ILO. So thank you again for being with us and answering a question that I'm sure you have been answering and trying to answer for many times. So my question to you as the ILO, and particularly in the labor conference, International Labor Conference is really evolving now. Could you introduce to the audience, both in the room and online, what social justice means for the ILO? I'm sure in the ILO, that's something that many people have heard, but just outside of the building, what really it means and what role it can play in the current conversation at the International Labor Conference happening over these 2 weeks.
Thank you for inviting me here, and thanks for the foundational first question, for which there is no clear, clean answer, I should say. There is really, to my knowledge, and I have spent a little bit of time looking into this, as you might imagine, since this is the signature area of focus for our new Director General, there is no single well-accepted, neatly defined formulation for social justice, either in academia or in the applied world, which of course the ILO is part of. However, in an attempt to try to provide a little bit of a foundation for response to your question, we have been looking at this question from a few different angles. The first, as the ambassador will know well, is that this is a foundational concept for the entire organization. You made reference to this in your speech, that lasting peace is just not possible without social justice. That was an animating principle 100 years ago or so. And then there were several elements of this that got further developed at another crucial turning point in the governance and institutional character of the ILO in 1944, as the war was beginning to turn and people were beginning to think about the future international economic and political order. There was a 1944 meeting of the ILC, the International Labor Conference. That 1944 edition of it took place in my hometown of Philadelphia. And the outcome of that meeting was a declaration which was swept into the constitution of the organization that said a number of interesting things that bear upon your question, Cedric. One, labor is not a commodity. Two, freedom of expression and association are essential to sustain progress. Three, poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. Other things along the lines of all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security, of equal opportunity. These are very important concepts. And for us as an institution, if you indulge me just a little bit more, to go from the principles, from the aspiration, to what it means in the applied world. What's the job of the ILO in all of this? The attainment of the conditions in which this shall be possible must constitute the central aim of national and international policy. All national and international policies and measures, in particular those of an economic and financial character, should be judged in this light, in the light of social justice, in the light of these more social considerations, and accepted only insofar as they may be held to promote and not hinder the achievement of this fundamental objective. That was a very hopeful time. It was a time of construction. It was a time of thinking big thoughts, like you just articulated, in a new era, political, but also economic and whatnot. And these words continue to echo the halls of the ILO today. And what I would do is then maybe go one step further and translate them into how we define this in more of, I would say, an operational format rather than a dictionary or an academic way. And there are four basic elements that pertain to social justice as it relates to particularly the world of work and adjacent areas of policy and human endeavor. And that adjacency is very, very important that I would mention. The first element is rights, universal rights. So the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948 had a number of material welfare related rights, the right to food, water, shelter, education, but also particularly pertinent to the competence or jurisdiction of the ILO, the right to work, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to Social Security. These are all, people don't realize this, particularly people in the councils of government and many times people in the business world now. So these are actually well accepted rights. In the 60s, they were adopted in an international covenant, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And governments, most governments around the world have committed to, quote, the progressive realization of these rights. These are very human-centered rights. They're not the right to the state, but they're rights to an individual. And therein lies the basis of this notion that I think you articulated very nicely, Director, earlier on, that we need to think about the economy in a way that is not, and I'm an economist, not oriented toward national statistical constructs like national income or GDP, as it's commonly known as, but basically what I call the lived experience of people. And that translates in economic terms into the standard of living at the median household level. That is a different way. That's the other end of the telescope, I like to say, of looking at economic and international economic policy. But it all begins with a set of rights that have been well recognized in this regard. Secondly, second pillar would be the practical, effective opportunity to access those rights. It's one thing to have a right enshrined in law, and so it's there in principle. But if the extent to which you actually enjoy that right is a function of many things, but not least institutional capacity of states to implement, to provide the protections and rights and benefits and opportunities embedded in those rights. That is a very important consideration. And I'll just flag here, particularly in relation to employment, to full, freely chosen productive employment. This is a term of art in the ILO. The employment is a foundational element here. There's a right there. There's an institutional set of levers one can pull or not pull, as many countries have been a little lax in doing so, to make that right live at the median level, at the household level for people. Thirdly, most people associate the notion of social justice also with some sense of fair distribution. There is no, absolute measure of what constitutes a fair distribution within a society within an economy, but most people would agree on the principle, and it's up to the basic polity itself to work out through its various devices how you arrive at a country's or a jurisdiction's own implementation of that notion, that principle of fair distribution. And the fourth element of an operational definition, if you will, that I'll mention at this point is perhaps a more modern one, and that is just transitions. It's most people, I think, in whatever society, whatever form of government or religious tradition, most would agree that a just society, when there are major disruptions and people are dislocated, that you don't just leave them to the wind, to the vagaries of chance, whether it's a natural disaster or technological disruption, as was described earlier, or long-term secular changes like demographic change, urbanization, or indeed climate change. That this notion of some sort of justness in the transition of people, not leaving them to fend for themselves in their own devices, some way to care for the most vulnerable and most marginalized in society. That's an important element of what most people would consider to be social justice. So let me stop here. There's obviously lots of layers to this onion that you can begin to peel, but I wanted to give you some sense of how we interpret this from the high conceptual to principles-based level to actually what that means when you get right down to it and you're debating policies in societies. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rick. Lots of points to actually follow up. And for the moment, again, I am going to follow my script and ask Ambassador Berset, from the perspective of the member state, and as we often teach to our students at the Graduate Institute, the ILO is a very specific governance construction, drawing from the very beginning thing of this tripartite. So states are member, but states are represented not only by government, but by employers and employees association. And in this context, of course, you see where my question is going to is that, social justice may mean many different things actually for whether you stand as an employer or an employee representation or actually for a government. So in the current context, the discussion of the LIC with this renewed focus, as Rick just said, by the Director General of the ILO on social justice, how do you see your discussion, cooperation with social partners around this notion of social justice? Do you see it as something that is really pulling a positive dynamic of efforts, or see tension or different perspective that you may have with different partners? And I know that as an ambassador, you have to probably, control what you're saying, but whatever you could actually be saying for us about this different perspective.
Thank you, Professor, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Maybe first thing I need to say and explain is that we have a tripartite delegation. Each country has a tripartite delegation, but the member states are not giving the view of the trade union or the employers organization. Each social partner is independent, and that is very important for you to have that in mind. There is no influence whatever from the government towards the social partners, what will be their position. That's the first point, very important to make. Beside that, of course, for those of you who know Switzerland, we have a deep tradition of social dialogue, social peace. And of course, we always prepare the conference together. So we have a tradition, we have a meeting in Bern with the social partners where we go through all the topics. And it goes, I must say, always very smoothly. It is a tradition, and each one is respecting the view of the other and sharing the view of the other. And the state is also sharing what the instructions are from the Federal Council. So that's very important to mention. Beside that, something also quite unique for Switzerland, and is that we are the only country having a tripartite strategy towards the ILO. which was actually revised last year and is based on social justice. So that was the choice of the social partners. And it makes, let's say, our life quite easy for the discussion on social justice in the ILO, because everything has been already determined in this strategy. It's, I mean, it's published on our website, so nothing is secret. The strategy, of course, is focusing on 3 main points and priorities. The first one is the strengthening of the governance and the democratization of the ILO. The second one is the promotion of standards and at the national level as well as internationally through technical cooperation. And the third priority is the contribution to the promotion of employment and social security in a perspective of resilience in the face of crisis. That was defined last year with our social partners, and it's the basis for us for all our discussion and negotiation with the ILO and with our colleagues in the International Labour Conference. Now, the social dialogue is something which is part of social justice and a very important part. So the focus of this year is for us a way to emphasize the importance of social dialogue, because through this awareness raising role, workers and employees association put forward their priorities and they can together address the pressing labor issues. Something else that I would like also to share with you during this conference, and it was said by Rick, there is a focus on social justice, but there is also a big focus, or at least for us, Switzerland and also our tripartite partners, on apprenticeship and skills and competencies, one, and second, just transition. Taking all that together, this is all part for us also of social justice. I will come back to that a little bit later on, but it's really very good that these 3 topics are at the heart of this International Labour Conference this year. We're also very proud because we have in the negotiation on apprenticeship a Swiss employer spokesperson. And we are proud of that because it makes also a lot of coherence for sharing the experience of Switzerland in the apprenticeship system really at the international level, and very pragmatic and practical without being too theoretical. And also, of course, maybe one point is important, and this is said very often by our minister, apprenticeship or skills, the system you have in one country cannot be exported to another one, even to the neighbor country as such, because there are so many conditions that need to be put in place. But we can, at least, I hope, through this new standard that we are negotiating now at the ILO, give some recommendation on how countries can put the system in place and help them to have that, but again, with a lot of flexibility. And my last word is about social cohesion also at the national level. It's not only the case for Switzerland, I think for almost all countries today, there is a big priority to ensure and promote social cohesion between the region, between the canton, between the social partners, and between the people. And I think this is applying also at the ILO. I was speaking about social dialogue, but social justice is also very important between the region of the world, and more and more difficult actually to ensure this dialogue between the region also in the International Labour Conference.
Struggling with this mic. So, Marie-Laure, I think, because I'm had questions, but you, as you said, warned me. You already kind of answered some of them, in your keynote. But my first question was, and I think you addressed it, at least you started to address it with your 3 scenarios. My first question was, let's face it, the mainstream thinking or mainstream narrative about the future, what the systems should address is zero net carbon emission. And would just basically, forget me to taking the famous ad from a well-known IT company, we just plug and pray. And so we're just going to make sure that, we're going to try to find net zero emission. And if it solves social justice, would improve social justice, be it. If not, at least we'll have saved the planet. It's a bit of a caricature, but it is. And so, of course, you said, but the 3 scenarios is clearly for you, an overarching goal would be to include social justice dimension, and not only quote unquote, of course, net zero carbon emission. So in that perspective, what do we need to do to actually just think of promoting the goal of the system, or promoting this issue of social justice as a higher level goal of systems or outcomes of the system than it currently is? And of course, as a director of education institution, how do we do it even at the daily life in our program at the institute?
Yeah, I think that that's really indeed a very important question. I would start from the notion of sustainability, because this is the key notion. And for me, sustainability has always included definitely the environmental, large definition of the environment, not just climate change, but biodiversity also, and the social dimension. And this has to be thought about in systemic way, in a kind of complexity, interconnection. I think there is a start of a realization, including in the economic sector, particularly, in discussions that we may have in the context of building bridges with bankers and others, that the sustainability cannot be about just net zero and the climate and the bio, and starting to think about nature, and not only climate at first, but they also more and more realize that the social dimension has to be included, and the social justice dimension has to be included in this thinking. I mean, I sometimes say that if we let the cancer of inequalities grow in the way we've done over the last 20, 30 years, we might be in big trouble first through social issues and social problems in different parts of the world, even before the climate change hits really bad, the environmental issues hit really bad. So this is something that indeed it starts to make its way in many parts and places. How do we play a role here? Where different ways. I mean, this is part of our transformation of our strategy. First, the affirmation in our strategy that sustainability in that sense is one of the core strategic direction, is part of that. And as you know, now this is actually impacting the way we are transforming our programs, the way we are redefining our main interdisciplinary program in particular, and the ways in which we are thinking about the different curricula that we're proposing to our students. So working at the level of curricula and realization, taking really those issues very seriously is an important one. It has an impact also on the way in which we do research. I'll just give another example of something we've done, which is launch the Swiss Lab for Sustainable Finance, which has very much this proposition of an integrated impact measurement system, where we would indeed find ways in which we can put in the hands of banks, economic actors, international actors like the World Bank and others, development banks, actually an integrated mechanism to measure prosperity, social prosperity in this multidimensional sense that includes obviously the economic issues, but also the environmental and the social justice dimension. Because in the medium to long run, there's going to be no resilience of a society if this is not indeed deeply integrated. So yes, I'm completely convinced of that. I've been convinced of that for many, many, many years, in fact. But I think, things are progressing, but we have to do a lot of pedagogical work. We have to help a generation of our students who is, I think, very naturally convinced of that. So we have to help them take that also in their own hands. And we have to do what we can. And I think, in particular, I'm trying to make sure that this initiative of the lab, which is a very important one, survives and really goes to definitely produce something that is concretely useful for economic, social actors in our communities and well beyond.
Thank you, Marie-Laure. So I'll turn to a second set of questions, both Rick and Valerie, and then we'll open to the floor. So Rick, and then broadening a bit the discussion, your Director General is calling for the Global Coalition for Social Justice, because the ILO, as all the speakers have said, the ambition of social justice is a very big one, and surely it cannot be advocated only or mostly by one international organization. Indeed, the ILO, even though that has been, the DNA of in the DNA of the organization for 100 years. And so, from that perspective, how do you? And it's a sensitive question because we know that the UN specialized agencies are not always speaking as one voice. How do you see the dynamics going for behind this global coalition for social justice? How would the ILO be able to really get the train going, maybe faster than it has been? What are your thoughts on this, of course, very challenging task to try to really kind of pull, let's say, forces behind this kind of higher priority given to social justice?
Well, it's a very topical and timely question. I think our constituents, including the one represented to my right here, are pondering the same question right now. So I have a couple of roles in the organization. One of them is to help the organization think through the substance of this coalition. So, but we are forging, to use the actual word, the coalition currently. It is not baked, if you will. So what I'm going to tell you are, some of the early thinking about what this might mean. The ILO, as you said, has a very central role to play in respect of social justice, but it's not an exclusive or exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. Most people think of our role practically as on the standard side, labor rights, labor protections. We've had a couple of citations of those processes. I mean, the apprenticeship process. Just in the last year, we added a fifth fundamental principle and rights, right at work, on occupational safety and health, which is a very, very big deal because it has spillover effects for many different aspects of corporate and national policymaking. But so you could think of that as well as universal social protection. It's the labor organization, but social security systems, social protection systems are a core part of the mandate of the organization. Skilling, sustainable enterprise development, employment creation, even macro policies that bear on that, all of that is the ILO. But that's still just one part of the broader canvas of social justice. And in part, even the ILO parts really require mainstreaming and greater investment by both national governments, corporates, and indeed the multilateral system, other international organizations. And this coalition is particularly about that. It's about how to enlist, if you want to use that word, greater political attention and priority on these kinds of issues in their programs that have a bearing on labor protection, on social protection, on sustainable enterprise development and governance, on skilling and the like, and other dimensions of this, on just transitions. Because multilateral development banks, for example, have a very important role to play in building institutional capacity in governments in developing countries, and indeed in their lending programs. And I could cite chapter and verse about any one of those areas where, if we're really going to have to dial up efforts on social justice, and particularly in developing countries, then the cooperative architecture in the world economy, including the multilateral development banks, but also the IMF in respect of social protection and fiscal space, and how they calculate what's macro critical without getting into too much technical detail here. That has a huge bearing on the scope that national policymakers have to be able to plan increased coverage of benefits and the level of benefits throughout their society. Trade, WTO, but not limited to the WTO, of plurilateral trade agreements, free trade agreements. They have a very important adjacent role in the treatment of work, of core labor standards, and the like. And so what I'm pointing to here is that we are thinking about this coalition as a mechanism to particularly engage many of these other institutions, both multilateral or international organizations, as well as national governments, and indeed companies and employer organizations, to think about and make additional investments and efforts behind what they can do to increase their activities as a vehicle for deepening and broadening the realization of these various dimensions of social justice. That part the ILO has had a mandate to do. It's partly why I referenced the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944. If part of what I just cited there gave us a mandate to work with other parts of the international system in this regard, but it has never really been fully activated by any stretch of the imagination. And I think one of the great opportunities that our new Director General is presenting for the ILO in all its constituencies is to, in fact, begin to move out of our own means of implementation in a more systematic and structured way to get other actors to basically work with us to do these things. And I think that it's coming, and I'll close here. I think for the reasons that you, Marie-Laure, laid out in your comments about the big disruptions going on and the big social questions and debates, I think it's coming at a time when other institutions have more of an appetite than perhaps ever before to be wanting to be part of an acceleration of the delivery and the realization of social justice. So maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that we might have had it more difficult. But I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be able to find specific concrete areas, and that's kind of my job here, to find win-win opportunities programmatically for the two institutions and make that kind of the backbone of what the coalition delivers. It's one thing to have a nice debate and have a aspirational signaling exercise. It's important to have political signaling. But at the end of the day, I think Switzerland and other governments and constituents are going to want to see concrete forward motion. And that's the basis on which I think we can build it.
Well, thank you, Rick. And I noticed that, 10 or 20 years ago, it was the focus on decent work, but now you're moving into, much broader kind of, as you said, ambition with social justice, which is, of course, decent work is part of, but only one part of it. So given that you mentioned of a member state, I'm going to close my last question to one of the member states, and Ambassador Berset was expecting me to have a surprising question, but I'm going to disappoint her because I'm not going to actually surprise you here. Given of the member states, so how would you, so of course, from a member state, you're a member of all these different organizations that Rick Sammons mentioned. And there are also a few, high-profile summits that are forthcoming. The first one is the SDG Summit. The next one next year is the Summit of the Future. How do you see your action with your peer member state in favor of pushing this notion of social justice in this big gathering? Of course, Switzerland is not part of neither G7, G20, but maybe also how these things will go for the G7, G20 by action with your partners. So more the big international politics of agenda setting and agenda dynamics in favor of social justice outside of the wall of the ILO.
Thank you very much. Before to answer this specific question, I would like to recall what Rick just said. There is one step about advocacy. within the ILO, I guess I mean, it's obvious. So this is, we should not lose too much time about that. Advocacy towards other partners and other UN organization, World Bank Group, etc. That's one point. But what we want to see is impact in the field and in the countries. And for that to happen and to get also the interest of other organizations, we need to have concrete programs on which we can focus. And as you mentioned, social justice is broad. So Switzerland will argue in the next months or so, and has argued already, we need to have priorities, and we will share what our priorities are. That will be done in the next week. That's one point. And then what will happen in the UN system? Of course, if we speak about SDGs, social justice is anchored in a wide range of SDGs, but let's mention at least SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 5, gender equality, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 10, reduced inequalities. So social justice is really inherent to the realization of the Agenda 2030, and this we need to, of course, communicate that also in all other fora. It is the duty and the role of member states to be coherent. So not only to ask the ILO to be coherent internally, but it is only from our push that the coherence can happen. So we need to be a bunch of countries pushing maybe 2 organizations to work together, but with a concrete agenda. So this is what we are now waiting for from the ILO to deliver. They should give us, okay, 2, 3 big things, big programs. I mean, we have ideas, but it has to come from them. And then we can get the World Bank on what particular topic and say, look, here we have a big opportunity to leverage, let's work together. And of course, if the donors and the member states are pushing together, it will happen. It's not enough that the DG is talking to the colleagues, they have good relationship and so on, but that will not be enough. At the end, we from the member states need to push. And that's, of course, I hope what the coalition will be done and will be, I hope this will be the result. Then the ultimate goal for us is also to prepare the social summit in 2025. So we consider that the Global Coalition on Social Justice should be the big component to deliver or to prepare the Social Summit 2025 at the UN level. The time is short. So as you know, Switzerland, we would like the system to be a bit quicker and to be able to prepare all these steps. Then again, and it was mentioned by Rick, social justice does not mean the same for everyone. So we have this debate to go through also in the International Labour Conference and ILO in general, and then to agree on the priorities with the social partners, because the social partners are very sensitive and then don't want always to share what they believe is their thing, to share it with the world. So that's another difficulty. But yeah, these are the next steps we see. We have clear ideas where we should put the priorities, but then yeah, we need to move together because we cannot do everything. We need to be pragmatic and we need to focus on some priorities. Also, what will be of the interest of the others, because you know what we believe or what the ILO believes would be nice, maybe will not find the interest of the World Bank or WTO. I mean, with WTO, what we could imagine, and we have already discussed that together with the platform, is at least to try to restart a dialogue between both organizations. That would be already nice to have. But then, of course, all our free trade agreements making reference to ILO, labor convention, and so on are going on and forward. And that is another path. And in that also, of course, we need the ILO to be on board and to help us and guide. Otherwise, the private sector and the private standards will do it, which is not really what we would like.
Well, thank you. So it just happened to be perfect timing. So we are now going to open to the floor. We have half an hour for Q&A. So I would just ask, we just collect, you know, unless there's only a single question, but I guess not. We collect a few and then turn back to the panel. Again, we have only half an hour, so please try to really make your point as short, as concise as possible. Otherwise, as chair, I'll have to intervene. And if you could just say, just introduce yourself, whether you are in the room or someone's going to make me signs. If yes, Juanita, if there are people online. So who wants to react or ask questions to many, you know, important issue but raised by panel members? Yes. So.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Question is primarily to Mr. Samans. In the global coalition for social justice that you just spoke about, I suppose it's all about human beings and social justice for them. And the two countries with the highest number of human beings are India and China. And they also have very substantial issues in this area. So what role do you see for these two countries in the upcoming global coalition?
No.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you so much for all the panelists today. And my question is for whoever feels like they would have a sufficient answer. It's what would be your recommendations for monitoring progress in incorporating social justice in the future of works? So how would you actually see a way of measuring it when it is implemented in the future of works? Thank you.
One more. It's dangerous to let you go. So I'll just go back to you.
Thank you. I have a very short question. Katja Huyo from Unrest. How will you incorporate the social justice issue for the majority of informal workers and those that are excluded from many of the systems that we have in place that actually provide access to rights and to social justice at the moment? And we still, I know the ILO is doing a lot, but you know, how will that feed into the coalition, but also, you know, in the work of all of us working for social justice? Thank you.
Also, I will have the panel answer these first three, and then we take another round, so whoever wants to start with any of these three. Rick, Valerie, Marie-Laure.
First question was really for me.
Yeah.
I will start, but then of course give the floor to Rick because I think he has many answers, more than we do. You spoke about informality, and actually that should be one of the priority of the coalition. But as I mentioned, this still needs to be defined. What kind of programs? I mean, that's the Swiss view. Huh? Maybe others have another view. What kind of programs can we really continue to finance, for example, in our case, we do finance a program on productivity, district work and informality in the ILO. We consider that we have already a range of good partners outside of the ILO, also working with the private sector and OECD and others. So for us, for example, that would be one way to leverage. But then, of course, it's we are waiting for, what I said, the big priorities. Then the measurement of social justice, this is also key of our discussion. We don't all agree. The ILO is working on that. Rick will tell you more about that, I guess. But I think they have the intention to produce a report next year on the state of social justice in the world. Then what we have requested from the member states is that this should not be one more reporting burden for us, because you may know, but the member states, once they have ratified ILO convention, they have to report each year on all the convention. I mean, not all, but okay, a number of conventions. So if we then have again to report on whatever indicator they are deciding on, we are not so happy. So we would prefer that they do this report on the basis of all the reporting system that they already have or they have access to. But this is also in discussion, how to measure. That has also been clearly discussed. There is no agreement for a listing of countries. You are number one in implementing social justice. You are number 100. So this is not accepted. But all this is really under discussion now.
Okay, on the role of India and China, I can't say at this point. This is going to need a real dialogue with those two very important countries. Maybe what I can say is that I see some interesting possibilities. One of the hats I wear in the organization is I'm the Sherpa to the G20, G7, and BRICS processes. And we just finished our penultimate drafting session in the G20 employment working group, the labor minister track of the G20 last week here in Geneva. And the Indian presidency has put on the agenda, and we seem to be succeeding as a group of 20 countries, a couple of areas that are quite relevant to social justice. One of which is principles or policy priorities for extending or ensuring social protection extends to gig and platform workers, which is a growing segment of the informal world. That's a non-trivial contribution. If countries and supporting cooperative institutions help ensure that's the case, that could make a significant contribution, because as you will know, many informal workers have limited to no meaningful social protection access. So that's being led by India, and India has been doing some very interesting things, in part building off of its digital public infrastructure, where it becomes easier to be able to reach people who are not working on a formal salaried contract, so that they can more easily and more inexpensively, with lower transaction costs, access public benefits, including social protection. So I think India is very proud of what it's been building by way of public services on the back of these digital innovations. And one could imagine this is one example of a way that India could make a meaningful contribution in cooperation with other countries, international institutions, and others, to help attack some of what was raised in the other question about the informal economy. That's one example. So we'll have to have discussions with both of those countries. In terms of the measurement of social justice, as Valerie has just said, indeed, we are planning to build over the next year or two a recurring flagship report on the state of social justice in the world. Our Director General is insistent that that have a quantitative dimension to it. And so indeed, we will be working through what kind of metrics. And we've begun some brainstorming around this. And one way of thinking about this are levels. I mean, there is a lot of widely available data on different parameters of social justice. If you think back to the 4 buckets that I mentioned in my first comments, what isn't so widely available, however, is taking one of those metrics and looking at it across different types of groups, social groups within a society. What you might think of, what sometimes people refer to as relational inequalities, gender, youth, different minorities or ethnicities and whatnot. And many people consider that to be part of, getting more to the bottom of social justice. It's one thing if you've got a reasonably good labor force participation and people have jobs. It's another thing that if there are wide disparities in this respect, and you could do the same with respect to skilling, social protection, many other things. And so this will be a challenge, but I'm giving you this as a sense of the opportunity where such a report could add value. The data will be better for more advanced countries, OECD countries, than they will for many poor countries, which don't survey as much in their labor force surveys or otherwise. But we have the means sometimes to be able to do our bespoke research and surveys in this area where we could potentially add some value in this dimension. One thing other that I'll mention is that there's a new international process underway on the corporate side, which I, whatever accident of career history here, I've had a role in creating, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that is after 20 years of voluntary reporting exercises like the Global Reporting Initiative, or the thing that I created and chaired for many years, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, SASB in the US. Now, finally, the regulators, the accounting authorities and the securities regulators have agreed to begin to put together an official standard, starting with climate, but then moving probably in the next couple of years to the social dimensions of reporting. And this becomes the same level of standardization as companies now have when they're reporting their financial results through IFRS, if you're familiar with that. It's the same organization. So the ILO needs to have a dialogue with that process to make sure that the key aspects of core labor standards and some of the other dimensions are included in that, because that will have a lot of influence, I think, on activity on the ground out there. Lastly, on informal workers, the question more broadly, as you have pointed out, this is a big hole in global social justice. And it arguably is growing wider in some of the areas that we mentioned before about the digital economy. I don't know exactly, again, it's too early. I can't stipulate here what the ILO is going to do or what some other organization should do with us. But I will tell you that I personally believe that there's an opportunity to take a page out of the book of what happened with respect to gender and its mainstreaming development cooperation about a decade or so ago. If you're involved in development cooperation, you will know that most development cooperation agencies of governments or international institutions, they have a standard expected process where they're going to apply a gender lens and make sure. That isn't the case with informality, despite the fact that, if you want to attack SDG 1, extreme poverty, you need work. 70% on average of the income of a household in both rich and poor countries comes from work, labor income. And so therefore the development profession, including those being trained here and in other great institutions, have to recognize that it isn't just about, as economists would tell you, or development professionals will tell you about basic needs or about development assistance or lending for infrastructure, as important as they are. If you want to sustainably reduce poverty, you have to attack that work element of it. And particularly the sharp end of that stick is in the informal economy. And so this is part of the reason why we think there's big opportunity for us to work much more closely with the multilateral development banks in this area. And I would add bilateral donors to develop what would a mainstreaming framework for informality in development cooperation look like. a group of bilateral development agencies could pioneer such a framework, which would be a strategic framework for themselves, not for the ILO, but for themselves, in determining to make sure that they are considering informality as a proper priority when they're making resource allocation decisions. Thanks.
Can I just add a very, very small point only on the measuring and monitoring dimension, which I think is one of the core issues. It's really one of the key challenges I think that we are all facing. I was mentioning before the financial sector. It's also actually one of the key issues. I think that there's a risk of being on one extreme or the other. One extreme being to actually go very far into actually measuring in very great detailed way. And, I'm a scientist, so I love that. And, being really very detailed in the way in which we are moving in that direction, which, has a legitimacy. But on the other hand, there's urgency. And so I see also the very pragmatic other side, which is to say, maybe it's time to focus on a few measurement elements that are maybe more widely acknowledged or accepted, and to have, to do both actually in a sense, and to both work on a longer term project that really allows us to understand global social justice in depth from nearly a scientific perspective, but also in the short term to have strong areas of action that are, identified and measured by a number of indicators that we mostly could agree on. I think that's probably, somewhere in between. The one other thing that I want to say on this is measuring the status quo versus measuring impact, which obviously is quite different. We see that also in with respect to the funding of a number of projects and the way in which the financial sector wants to measure impact versus measuring actually what companies are already doing today. And this is much more complicated, obviously, because there's the temporal dimensions, there's the unexpected consequences of some of the actions you're doing. But I think we need also to really work in that direction to have impact measurement that include that temporal dimension, and that's not making it easier. But I think we have to take that into account when we think back.
Okay, thank you. So we have now a second round of questions. There's still some appetite. You've been waiting for a while, so, and then Maria. So gentleman here, the red jacket here, and then, yeah.
I am not a gentleman, just a incompetent journalist, even more than average. In the post-war time, we believe in the messianic times, that is where the work in the north, the worker in the south, the employer, the temporary jobless, the freelance would prosper side by side toward a happy end. In the past 30 or 40 years, we have witnessed lingering or increasing joblessness, outsourcing from the north to the south to avoid corporate failure, Uberization to give in to consumer demands. Don't you think that what we have witnessed in the past quarter of half century show that a common definition of justice between wage earners, consumers, north, south, jobless, farmers, freelancers, not only is not getting closer, but is fading away? I have bad hearing, so maybe you partly addressed these issues before.
Thank you. No, I don't think we have actually not fully addressed it, so I'm sure there'll be still lots of things to be said. Then we have Maya, and if anyone else wants to raise.
Yes, thank you so much. A question to all the panelists, but especially to Professor Sal, our director. You laid out a number of scenarios, some dystopian, other utopian. In ancient Greek, we have three words actually. We have dystopia, dystopian, utopia, utopian, but also eftopia, utopian, which is a state of perfection, but in realistic terms, not utopia, which is, idealistic terms. So what would you consider as or describe as a utopian, utopian state of affairs, of future in relation to the future of work? What will be
So you want the
utopian, a state of perfection, but in realistic terms, which actually means translating social justice into concrete policy outcomes.
Additional question?
Thank you very much, panelists. You're tackling very, very challenging questions. Simple one, I would love to hear your views. Is universal basic income inevitable? Maybe way far in the future, but do you see that it would be inevitable given how we're evolving in our societies?
Okay, so back to you, panel members. So the way you want, which one you want to address, that you collectively organize?
Try to answer the question. I mean, not possible to answer the question, but to come back to the question of Mr. Journalist. Sorry. I try to answer or come back to the question, the first question. The definition of social justice is more and more difficult if we discuss with all the partners. This is a bit what I understood, and even that we are all far away from each other even more than before. Definition, yeah. I think this analysis is right, because what we see now, for example, in the discussion we have within the ILO is that it's very difficult to agree on what is social justice. We all have different priorities because of different challenges within our countries or within our population. And yeah, I can only say that this is one reason why I also come back to the measurement. I believe that we have to concentrate on very little indicators and not too many, because we will not agree on too many. And I always recall that actually, if we speak about rights, and we had this discussion again also in the ILO, and Rick mentioned, he spoke about human rights. I'm also in charge of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, by the way, in Switzerland. So, but I think if we want to prioritize, first of all, we have to prioritize on the fundamental rights at work, which are clearly defined internationally and recognized also at the UN. And not, I mean, it will not be possible to measure all human rights. So that's our view. First, concentrate on the fundamental principles and rights at work, which are clearly defined and agreed internationally. That's first priority. And on that, because we have already an agreement within the ILO and outside, okay, that should not be discussed. It is clear, agreed, and that's the basis. As soon as we are going to deep and say, no, but we will look to for another indicator, and which is not internationally recognized, then we will get into a lot of difficulties. So at least these before 4, now 5 principles and rights at work, this should be the basis, and it has been recognized. So that would be what I argue in favor of, trying to find a consensus on that. But again, we don't all agree on that.
So yeah, those are indeed very, very big questions. I will start with oh gosh, 5 minutes on top. And that means 3 minutes for me because I want to leave Rick the last word. So maybe I'll start with the universal basic income because it helps me also a bit answer the second question. My take on the universal basic income is that there will in big likelihood we'll have to use it, but not in the way that some people are proposing to use it. I don't believe in a universal basic income from a neoliberal perspective, which essentially kills social protection system. It's a way to kill the social protection system. So I don't believe that that's the way to go. What I believe in is things that are not actually so often discussed, which is maybe, a time bound universal basic income that people can take like you have this on your human account in a sense when you're born. So you have for number of years, it can be 5, 10, depending on the moment in your life, that you can take actually, the privilege of using this when you want, whether you use it when you're a student or later on in your life if you want to retire early, etc. But a system that would be along those lines. So I think that, yes, moving towards a framework that doesn't question, social protection, on the other hand, that needs to be, kept in different ways, but nevertheless prevents, total deprivations at times or situations of extreme poverty, etc. I think is probably something we'll have to move towards, which is maybe a bit this utopia dimension, which is certainly a mixed, I said those were ideal typical scenarios. So probably the utopia one is somewhere in between my last one and a bit of the second one on this front of the basic income. Definitely not on the side of technology devouring ourselves. So
I don't know that I have much to add, frankly. My preference tends to go toward guaranteed employment of some sort rather than a basic income. Also complicated, but just what I think a better focus of policy. And in terms of this practical utopia, if I could call it that, it's obviously an extremely difficult question to answer, but I mean, as the ambassador said, fundamental rights are part of that. In my mind, it's both we're not talking about measurement, by the way, we're now just talking about what can we feasibly seek to obtain, right, in economies, and the fundamental rights principles at work, but also basic capabilities so that people have practical, reasonable degree of opportunity, equal opportunity. To make something of their lives in their own image of what they would feel would be worthwhile for their time. And some degree, we have this notion in the ILO of social protection floors. So on a societal basis, also having some degree of basic social protection in the key areas seems to me to be feasible over time, over a series of decades. And then on the livelihood side, it's not just about rights, it's also about and capabilities. Those are important, but the macro economic policy approaches and what the policymakers at the cabinet level focus on, that there's a lot of change that needs to take place there. And you hinted at it in your early remarks. I'm working on this myself in my own research and writing, but I think that would be another element that is attainable. It requires a change in mental model, I like to say, but it is attainable. I think we are misallocating capital in the world. We are underinvesting on the public side, and the combination of that private misallocation of capital and underinvestment on the public side is significantly limiting the realization of human potential in all societies, I would say. And I think that's something we, over a few decades, could try to lick. Thank you.
Well, amazing, 59. So Kitrona, I see I could really keep the thing within time, even though you had reminding us of the minutes. So it's great. Thank you. And of course, I was just to follow up on Rick. I'm sure if we had Thomas Piketty on the panel, he would have come up with also a different solution and about, income redistribution and taxation and how debate. And I think even the people in Geneva are going to vote again soon. So thank you to panel members, but I hope that they stimulated a lot of thoughts and can follow up question and also action and activism on the parts of you in the room and the one online. But really deepest thanks to all of you, because it's really, we all have very busy agenda to show up and to really be spending 1 hour and a half with us. It was really, really deeply appreciated. And so again, as Kitrona said, for you in the room online, we have lots of events that Kitrona, kind of assembled all these different workshop panels, but actually you could really exchange and further continue discussion. As we say, we have a safe haven, we're an academic institution, so you're not going to be hopefully quoted for things that you do here and to think a bit outside of the choir, but I must say, very appreciative also Ambassador Bursey, which actually was not too much using langue de bois, as we say in French. You never know, but I think it's a pretty rare denrée rare, as we say in French. So really, thank you very much for doing that, and to Rick also for sharing your insights from a very high-level meeting, and for Marie-Laure taking the time despite having to show up in all the platform and centers that the Institute is hosting, and still hoping having a life outside of that. Well, I imagine, okay. Okay, so thank you very much, and have a nice end of the day and nice evening.